God morgen. God morgen. Velkommen alle sammen til denne konference om udfordringerne ved indvandring og integration. Vi har her i ROCKWOOL Fonden glædet os rigtig meget til dagen. Emnerne indvandring og integration er væsentlige emner, som over tid har fyldt meget i dansk politik og fortsat gør det. Derfor er det også dejligt at se, at så mange har valgt at deltage i konferencen hos os i dag. Der er udskrevet folketingsvalg, der drives valgkamp på livet løs, og forhåbentlig har mange lyst til at være med til at sikre et ordentligt og velfunderet grundlag for debatterne i valgkampen. For god ordens skyld vil jeg nævne, at vores konference i dag var planlagt længe før, og invitationerne var sendt ud længe før statsministeren valgte at trykke på valgknappen. Det er altså ikke i anledning af valget, at vi holder konferencen i dag. Jeg tænker, i den forbindelse falder det mig også naturligt at nævne et par af ROCKWOOL Fondens kerneværdier. Uafhængighed, og det ikke at være policy-anbefalende. For i dag gælder det hos os i ROCKWOOL Fonden det samme som alle andre dage hele året. Vi blander os ikke i valgkampe, og vi anviser aldrig konkrete løsninger eller forslag. Lidt højdragende kan man sige, vi lever for og af at levere solid og relevant forskning, som kan skabe den bedst tænkelige platform for politikudvikling. Emnerne indvandring og integration er emner, vi i ROCKWOOL Fondens forskningsenhed har haft fokus på i mere end 20 år, med mange forskellige forskningsindsatser. Et centralt forskningsområde har været velfærdsstatens sociale og finansielle bæredygtighed under øget indvandring. Og der har samtidig været fokus på indvandrergruppers beskæftigelse og levevilkår. I samme periode har ROCKWOOL Fondens forskningsenhed belyst de udfordringer, som indvandring og manglende integration skaber for velfærdsstaten, men også belyst, om integrationstiltag virker. I dag vil vi forsøge at give jer et helikopterperspektiv på den nyeste viden om indvandring og effekten af integrationsindsatserne, både her i Danmark, men også i Europa. And then with us here today, and therefore a special welcome to the Deputy Director General of Migration and Home Affairs of the European Commission, Mr. Simon Mordue, and from the University College of London, Professor Christian Dustmann. You have both agreed to share with us your insights on immigration and in the European perspective. Thank you so very much, both of you, for being with us today. Jeg håber, at dagens input vil give jer en god indsigt i emnet, og I efterfølgende naturligvis meget velkomne til at søge yderligere viden ved at opsøge os. Vi stiller gerne op med præsentation af vores forskning ude omkring, så tag endelig fat i os, brug vores forskning og vores forskere. Vores fornemmeste mål er at skabe ny og uafhængig viden om samfundets udfordringer, men jo ikke mindst også at få den viden udbredt, så den kan forbedre vidensniveauet og kvaliteten af debatterne, og ikke mindst af beslutningsgrundlaget for de centrale beslutningstagere i samfundet. Endnu en gang rigtig hjertelig velkommen til jer alle sammen. Og nu vil jeg give ordet til Nynne, der vil hjælpe os igennem dagen. Tak.
Tak skal du have, Elin, og det er rigtigt, jeg hedder Nynne Christensen, jeg er journalist, og jeg skal få os godt igennem formiddagens program heroppe mod kl. 13, hvor der bliver serveret frokost for os. Lad mig lige løbe programmet igennem, fordi vi skal have, som Elin også sagde, vi starter med 2 internationale oplæg. Det første vil Simon Mordue, som er vicegeneraldirektør i Kommissionen, og han vil tale om at man ved om integration og immigration i den europæiske kontekst og status på debatten i Europa. Og efterfølgende kommer professor Christian Dustmann fra UCL, og han vil tale om, hvad vi ved om effekten af immigration og integrationspolitikker i Europa. Bestemt absolut meget relevante spørgsmål i dag. Vi holder en pause kl. 10.45 op mod kl. 11, og så får vi 4 korte oplæg her fra forskningsenheden. Det er Camilla Wittfeldt, der taler om ventetid i det danske asylsystem, hvad er effekten af det og betydningen af det. Jakob Nielsen Arndt vil tale om effekten af job first fokus i Danmark. Det er jo et fokus, der ikke bare er på på flygtninge, men også i hele beskæftigelsesområdet. Marie-Louise Schultz-Nielsen vil tale om indvandrers opholdsgrundlag og arbejdsmarkedsintegration, og slutligt vil Jan Rose Skaksen tale om indvandringens økonomiske konsekvenser. Det er sådan hele vejen igennem, både i forhold til de første oplæg, de internationale, og i forhold til de her oplæg fra Forskningsfonden, at vi har lagt lidt tid af til spørgsmål fra salen efterfølgende. Jeg håber meget, I har lyst til at deltage og byde ind. Der er meget kompetence i salen, så det er meget velkomne til. Efter de 4 oplæg fra Forskningsfonden, så har vi en afsluttende paneldebat, hvor vi ryger lidt op i helikopterperspektivet og taler om det her med, jamen altså, hvad betyder det for de allersvageste indvandrere at komme i arbejde. Det er Jakob Holbrød og Ejner K. Holst, de 2 arbejdsmarkedsparter, altså Jakob Holbrød, der er direktør i DA, Ejner Holst, der er næstformand i FH, som drøfter det sammen med Andreas Kamm, som er ærespræsident i Dansk Flygtningehjælp, og Bent Madsen, som er administrerende direktør i Danmarks Almene Boliger, som jo altså gør en ret betydelig boligsocial indsats. Så de 4 skal prøve at finde sammen om, hvad er egentlig effekten af at få folk i arbejde, og hvad er betydningen af det. Også efter den debat har vi lidt spørgsmål fra salen, så jeg håber meget, I har lyst til at deltage. Så er vi altså programmet op mod kl. 13, hvor Elin hun runder af igen. Ladies and gentlemen, today's first speaker is Deputy Director General Simon Mordue from the European Commission. He will speak about facts about immigration and integration in Europe and the state and consequences of the current EU debates on the topic. Please, Mr. Mordue, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you here today in Copenhagen. What I thought I would do is perhaps just give you a sense of the debate raging still in Europe on migration, some of what has been achieved over the last couple of years, and perhaps some of the challenges as we move ahead. The first point I would just make is that we're now a couple of weeks before the European elections, and if one would at times listen to some of the rhetoric and some of the narrative, one would have the impression that Europe was still in the midst of a refugee crisis. And when I talk to some of my friends from Turkey, from Jordan and Lebanon, and I explain to them that last year, calendar year 2018, what are effectively 28 of amongst the world's richest economies had a total of 150,000 irregular arrivals, they look at me with bewilderment and say, but hang on a second, how can this possibly be a crisis? In Jordan or Lebanon, nearly 50% of our population are effectively refugees. And I think this is, unfortunately, one of the sad aspects about the debate on migration at the moment. The reality in some ways is we are not actually facing a migration crisis at the moment in the European Union. We're still trying to deal to some extent with a self-made political crisis. I think it's true if you looked back in 2015, 2016, where we were at times dealing with 10,000 arrivals in a single day. That was a migration crisis, but the figures today are not. What happened last year and where did the people arrive and what has brought about, if you like, this drop from 2015-2016? Well, if we look at the primary points of arrival last year for irregular arrivals, you're talking basically about 3 main countries in number terms. The first last year was Spain, with some 65,000 people arriving. A very significant increase from previous years, in fact actually around 130% increase, primarily coming in from Morocco, and quite a bit of actually of displacement if you look at the nationalities from people who were arriving previously in Italy from Libya. Those figures have started to drop a tiny bit over the last few months. I think our engagement in particular with Morocco is now beginning to pay dividends. Last year as well we saw still quite a few people coming into Greece. There was around 48,000 people, so a huge drop compared to what we saw at the height of the migratory movements in 2015, 2016. I'll talk in a while about the EU-Turkey statement, which has been the game changer there. But again, a drop in the ocean compared to what we were dealing with before. And in Italy, the drops we began to witness in 2017 already were sustained in 2018 with a huge drop and only 23,000 arrivals in Italy, a trend which has been very much sustained this year with on average less than 10 people a day arriving in Italy in the first months of 2019. One thing I should have just said on Greece is what you've seen last year on Greece as well is a significant increase in the number of irregular arrivals over the land border, in particular Turkish nationals. Now, how was this drop achieved? Well, what I would say, if I can be fairly provocative, is it was primarily achieved through action on the external dimension. I still think we have an awful lot of work to do on the internal dimension, and that our asylum systems, our migration management systems are not yet, in my view, fit for the challenging days. This is why we've got on the table the reform of the Common European Asylum System, which would have hugely valuable reforms in there that would make our migration systems much better able to cope with the complexity of mixed migration flows, so flows which will contain both people needing protection and people who are perhaps coming for other reasons. And I think this is probably the biggest single challenge that Europe faces over the next years. How can we make sure that our migration management systems are able to deal with mixed migratory flows? Migration is not going away. Migration is not going to disappear. If anything, the pressure is going to increase. I think it is incumbent upon us to have systems which are rigorous, efficient, and fair, and are able to make that distinction between people who are genuinely needing protection and asylum and people who are coming for other reasons, which we will need people, but I think it's important that the people who are coming, for example, for primarily economic reasons are coming on legal pathways. I also believe for our citizens to still have confidence in what we are doing in the field of migration, they need to feel assurances that when people arrive irregularly, our migration management systems are robust enough to be able to return them. And I think, if you like, for me, that is a sine qua non for the other side of the coin, that it's still, I believe, right that Europe, as one of the richest parts of the world, is able to offer protection to those in need. But what we need to be trying to do is offer that through resettlement places rather than actually subcontracting the choice of who comes and benefits from protection to unscrupulous smugglers and having people having to effectively risk their lives to get the benefit of protection in the European Union. And this is what was characterizing some of what we've seen over the last 2-3 years. Highly organized smugglers' rings, mercilessly profiting from the desperation of many people and able to do so. Now, what were the game changers? Well, the EU-Turkey statement has been seen by many as quite controversial, but it was highly effective. Since the EU-Turkey statement was activated in March 2016, the number of people who've arrived in the European Union on that route has dropped to on average around 80 a day. And again, we go back and we were at 10,000. Now, one of the aspects of this was to work hand in hand with the Turks, also on ensuring that particularly the Syrians, and there are close to 4 million Syrians in Turkey, were able to benefit from support in Turkey. So we had a facility called the Facility for Refugees in Turkey. In my view, this has been costly, but a resounding success. To give you some examples, last year in 2018 alone, over 650,000 Syrian children benefited from full-time education in Turkish schools, a credit to Turkey, but also funded by the Facility for Refugees in Turkey. The healthcare costs of 1.5 million Syrians were covered last year in Turkey by the Facility for Refugees in Turkey. We have these little cash cards that are handed out to the refugees to allow them to spend money with a degree of dignity and self-control, all funded by the Facility for Refugees in Turkey. And when we look at the profile of people who are arriving in Greece, and I have some of my staff present on each of the Greek islands, a good example also of the, if you like, the changing nature of the work in the Commission, we've had to become as a body much, much more operational. What we see from some of the debriefing interviews is that there are virtually no Syrians who are arriving in Greece who've been in Turkey for any period of time. Last year, Syrians accounted for only around 8% of the arrivals on the Greek islands, and that came at a particular period, 2 to 3 months after the troubles, for example, in Afrin. You saw displacement of people in Syria into Turkey and then onward movement. But we were not seeing movement of people who had been in Turkey for a long period of time. So one of the policy conclusions I draw from that is I do think the Facility for Refugees in Turkey has played a role in supporting the efforts of the Turkish government and allowing Syrian people to put roots down and establish themselves in Turkey and be disincentivized from onward movement. Now, what are we seeing in terms of the people arriving at the moment? Huge numbers of Afghanis arriving. Last year you had 250,000 Afghanis coming into Turkey alone. And now you see that very much on the islands. You go to an island like Lesbos, and at the moment 85% of the arrivals on the island of Lesbos are from Afghanistan. But we're also seeing, again, some displacement of nationalities. You have strange phenomena. So you have, for example, some of the people who were coming into Italy from Libya, particularly from Congo, from Guinea, from Cameroon. They are now all arriving on the little island of Samos. Smugglers clearly targeted that for sub-Saharan Africans. It's in part for strange reasons. There's a little Catholic church just behind the town square on Vati, so people particularly of the Catholic faith have established themselves there. We're seeing on the little island of Leros, for example, now large numbers of Palestinians coming in. So the smugglers are very, very deft and adept at targeting their marketing model, and they're also, frankly, profiting from the lack of transit visas required by Turkey for some of these nationalities, which is one of the discussions that I've been having with the Turkish Deputy Foreign Minister for some time now. This has obviously put a lot of pressure on Greece. There's no doubt about that. The islands have faced overcrowding. They've faced challenges. I would also say that perhaps there is, I'll put this diplomatically, a tiny bit more work to be done on effectively returning people to Turkey from Greece, because the idea behind the EU-Turkey statement originally was that once you had had an individualized assessment, unless there was a reason why you as an individual couldn't be returned to Turkey, you should be returned. In total, there's only been around 2,000 people returned to Turkey since the activation of this statement, and it's not really happening at the speed it should. And I think this is actually creating a pull factor, because the smugglers are effective at marketing an offer that effectively says if you appeal each stage of the way, you will never be returned to Turkey. And this is something we're working harder with the Greek government on, but I think more needs to be done. If I look on what happened on the arrivals in Italy, it's a similar tale. I think the main game changer here was, again, the external dimension. Not just Libya. Libya is the one which is perhaps the most controversial. It was not an easy decision for us. We had to reflect hard. Should we engage? How should we engage? In the end, we chose to engage with Libya, but we chose to engage with Libya in a tripartite setting together with the African Union and the United Nations. So that has, for example, meant that we've been able to get out of Libya in the last 18 months some 40,000 sub-Saharan African migrants and get them returned home with dignified voluntary return packages, get them out of these fairly horrific detention camps. For those people needing protection, we were able to get out around 2,500 people out of Libya into Niger, and from Niger through onward resettlement, because these were people who needed protection, into the European Union. We've also been able to put some pressure on the Libyan government, I use the word carefully, to try and empty the detention centres. And obviously it's very challenging at the moment with the conflict, but I think without this engagement we would have many more people who would be in a far worse situation than is the case today. We've also worked with the Libyan Coast Guard, again a rather controversial aspect of our work, I admit that. But this has meant that the total number of people losing their lives in the Mediterranean Sea has dropped. and the Libyan Coast Guard is now effectively able to patrol its territorial waters, so the 12 nautical miles off the Libyan shore. Because one thing we had seen was the smugglers were also effectively changing their business model. They were using very, very flimsy, rickety vessels which were designed to get to 12 nautical miles only, whereupon they would be rescued either by EU naval assets or some of the NGO ships that were operating. But this meant, because the vessels were so flimsy, there were huge numbers of lives being lost in that water. We've also provided to the Libyan Coast Guard training on human rights-based search and rescue operations delivered with UNHCR and IOM. And we're working hard also to bring more transparency about what happens to people at the point of disembarkation. Probably the biggest single game changer, though, in dropping the numbers was not necessarily the engagement with Libya. It was really the engagement with Niger, because Niger, a place called Agadez, was the kind of crossroads of all the major migratory routes in sub-Saharan Africa. So we engaged very much with Niger. As a result of that, we were able to drop the numbers coming into Libya. It was 70,000 a month coming in from Niger into Libya at the peak. It's down to around a maximum of 7,000 at the moment. That came through working hard with the Niger authorities, also providing for voluntary return programs out of Agadez, working with the local communities to develop alternative economic possibilities other than smuggling. You know, in some of these areas, the Tuareg have traditionally moved people through the deserts. That has been their historical job. So what we perceive as smuggling, they perceived as classical work, taking people from A to B through a desert. So we've had to engage with them. We've provided a lot of political engagement as well. I mean, I've been on many occasions with the Sherpas of Mrs. Merkel, the advisor of the French President. Mrs. Merkel herself has been a couple of times, and this has, I think, made a big difference. We've also worked quite hard on the return side. It's something that Europe still struggles to do. We often don't get the linkages right between the asylum procedures and the return procedures. We're often not able to get the third countries to accept their citizens. Here in the last couple of years, we've negotiated around, I think, 23 return readmission agreements or arrangements with countries such as Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and member states are now beginning to use these, but we've still got much, much more to do. I think if you look at the figures, in the last 3 years we've returned around 600,000 people, but our return rate, so the percentage of return decisions which we're actually able as the European Union to implement, fell last year to around 36%, so just over 1 in 3. And again, I think for confidence in a migration management system, this is an essential element. One other development here is that the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, and I'll say a bit more about this later on, this is effectively also becoming a kind of operational arm for the conduct of return for the European Union. So I think in the longer term perspective, what will probably happen is that national asylum systems, when a negative decision is taken and a return decision is issued, it will then be up to the agency to organise the conduct of those operations. Now, on the internal side, I said before that I felt most of our achievements had come primarily on the external dimension. I think it's very unfortunate that 2 or 3 years after the presentation of a comprehensive reform of the common European asylum system, these reforms are still not adopted. There's been a lot of talk about the question of mandatory or voluntary relocation. I think it's a bit misleading to see that as the key essential element. It's obviously become the very political element, but honestly I would see the question of mandatory versus voluntary relocation a bit like the cherry on the cake. I think if you've got properly designed systems that are working, you will be able to find solutions for relocation. So at some point I think it's important that we reset the debate around this and look to make sure that some of the other vital elements of reform that would be hugely important come through. Because I think, although, as I said before, I don't think we can say that the European Union is necessarily facing a migration crisis today, the pressure on some of the frontline member states, particularly Greece, Cyprus I didn't mention because in total volumes it's very small, but in per capita terms it's very high, as is Malta, is too high. And I think one of the unfortunate things at times in the debate is some of the basic principles of the European Union, like solidarity, seem to have been jettisoned out of the window, and mutual support and working together appears to be lower down the priority list than one would have thought should be the case in a European Union which should be based on values. There are also hugely important reform elements in the reform of the common European asylum system that have been proposed. Take the Dublin Regulation. For me, quite honestly, the Dublin Regulation today isn't really fit for purpose. It corresponds to a reality that no longer exists. It was designed primarily to stop secondary movements at a time where the dispersal of arrivals around the European Union was fairly equal, and it wasn't really designed in a period where people were primarily arriving by sea. So I think we need to build in mechanisms that can provide support to a member state when it is feeling under a lot of pressure. But equally, there are other hugely important elements in there. If you look, for example, at recognition rates for asylum seekers within the European Union, there are vast differences and divergences. If you take, for example, Afghanis, you have certain member states that have an average EU recognition rate for Afghani citizens of 99%. You have other member states that have a recognition rate of Afghani citizens of 1 to 2%. Now, it doesn't take a genius to work out that that is likely to incentivize asylum shopping. Equally, you have similar disparities with recognition rates for citizens from Iraq. So I think until we bring much more convergence in asylum recognition rates, we're likely to still see systems which are dominated by secondary movements and dominated by choices driven by such divergences. Other elements of the asylum package that would bring about, in my view, important changes. If you look at the asylum procedures today, one of the difficulties we have is often our systems don't effectively decide whether somebody has a ground for seeking asylum or not. They're not able to make a filtering of people at a relatively early stage. So people can sometimes end up being in our systems for 2 or 3 years without necessarily having the slightest chance of getting asylum. That leads to an enormous amount of frustration. I think it also, in some cases, incentivizes people to come irregularly because they know the worst thing that could possibly be happened is that they're returned after a couple of years, being able to work after 6 months. I mean, if you want to put it totally cynically, at times you could perhaps see you as running some systems equivalent to an Erasmus scheme for irregular migrants. I think we need to have robust, fair systems that are able to make that distinction, and this is what some of the reforms would have done. Another example, we're still seeing today quite a lot of asylum claims coming up in member states, particularly some of the member states in the north like Germany, but also Denmark, Sweden and the Netherlands, where people are not appearing in what we call the Eurodac database. And it's not because they haven't been registered, but one of the anomalies today is that the data on asylum claims is deleted after 18 months. So people go underground, wait, and then reapply for asylum after 18 months. So one of the fundamental things we proposed to change was to align this to a longer duration for a first period of responsibility. And these are all reforms that are actually on the table. So I draw as a conclusion myself that I think one of the top priorities for a new commission and one of the top priorities post the election of a new parliament should be to actually get our house in order so we have a migration management system that is fit for the challenging days and not just fit for the good days. Now, there are things that have been done. As I speak today, we have 1,500 staff of the European Border and Coast Guard Agency deployed in different member states, in Greece, in Bulgaria. That has been a quantum leap. The Parliament and Council have just reached an agreement on the European Border and Coast Guard Agency 2.0, which will effectively have a core of 10,000 staff able to be deployed at borders that are under pressure. And I think there's much more sensitivity now about the importance of being able to adequately protect our borders. So this will be operational as of later this year, and I think will make a huge difference. Staff will actually be able to be deployed with effective executive powers, which is not the case today. So staff from the European Border and Coast Guard Agency can do tasks at the border, but no tasks actually involving executive powers. We've also recently concluded agreements with the vast majority of the Western Balkan countries, which will allow deployment of EU border guards with executive powers in the Balkans, because we've seen quite a few of the Balkan states coming under pressure with migratory movements onwards, trying to reach the EU. We've also done a lot of work on the database side, on the electronic systems, with a raft of proposals. So we have a Schengen information system now up and running. And just to give you a few examples of that, if I take the last calendar year, the Schengen information system was consulted over 5 billion times by EU member states, 5 billion times, and has produced some quite significant impacts. So since it's been running in 2013, we've had over 50,000 people arrested for offences committed in another member state due to information drawn from the Schengen information system. We've had 150,000 people refused entry onto the territory of the European Union because of alerts in the Schengen information system, and over 28,000 missing people were identified, again, due to alerts in the Schengen information system. And I think one of our challenges in the next few years will be making sure that all of these different databases, entry-exit systems, Schengen information systems, visa information systems, the European Travel Authorization Scheme, they're all interoperable, and that interior ministers know that the system is able to make a distinction between information that is important, that information isn't important. Because if you want to be cynical, there's probably only one thing more dangerous for a politician than not having the information, is that the information was there and nobody acted upon it. So this will be, I think, one of the challenges as we move across. I think we've also got further work to do on legal pathways. One of the things we've gathered some experience in the last few years is what we call resettlement. So for people who need protection, actually bringing them directly to the European Union from a third country. So in the last couple of years, we've resettled over 50,000 people at the EU level. This was backed with quite significant EU funding. We've provided a lump sum of €10,000 per person that people resettle. But I want to see us being much more active here, because I think for those countries who want to continue to offer protection to people in need, resettlement for me is by far the best tool to do this. You can offer support to people pre-departure, you can begin your language learnings, you can begin sensitizing people about the kind of environment in which they're living before they arrive. So we're, I think, most probably going to launch a further pledging exercise on this over the next few years, over the next few months. And again, one of the important elements in the package which is still not adopted is to have a resettlement framework at the EU level where we would be able to bring order into this. I mentioned before returns. I think there's still much more we need to do there. Again, another key piece of legislation that's on the table is a reform of the return directive, which tries to bring the linkages between the asylum process and the return process better into focus and make sure that we're effectively able to return people. One thing I wanted to mention as well, I mentioned this has had implications also for the work of the European Commission. I know this isn't the focus of this topic, but it is very interesting to see what this has meant. If you'd have taken my own Directorate General, DG Home, 5 or 6 years ago, we would have been primarily staffed by very fine lawyers, able to craft legal texts, able to launch and manage infringement proceedings, but we were not particularly operational. I now have teams on the ground in each of the Greek islands. I have around 20 staff active in Greece. I have a small office in Italy. I've had staff present in the hotspots in Sicily. We've had to write the operational guide for member states, what precisely should happen at a point of disembarkation and how. I've had to roll the sleeves up and change the profile of staff working. We've now got people who come from this background, have got a background as police, border guards, so we've had to become much more operational in the kind of day-to-day support that we are providing to member states. We've also had to significantly increase our work on the intelligence side. One of the challenges we've faced is how can we take action to effectively begin to tackle some of the smuggling rings. Well, one of the challenges we faced was that we had, a year or two ago, we had very, very thick Chinese walls between some of the foreign policy missions and some of the justice and home affairs agencies. So intelligence and data that was being gathered, for example, by some of the naval operations of Operation Sophia, when people were being rescued, details on who were the smugglers that had offered their package, wasn't actually able to be passed to some of our JHA agencies like Europol. So we had to change the mandates, break down these Chinese walls, and then with Europol we've created a kind of clearinghouse, a repository for intelligence information, working hand in hand with Interpol and then with some of the third countries' authorities. And this has had a couple of quite big successes. Probably one example I would quote is I think in the last 12 months there's been over 14 different smuggling rings dismantled in Niger and 130 people successfully prosecuted. So this is perhaps an aspect of the work that isn't often seen, but behind a lot of what we're doing is a real direct attempt to get after the business model of some of the smugglers and put an end to that. Now coming on to legal migration and integration. If you look in 2017, the European Union granted over 3 million residence permits for the first time to third country nationals. And sometimes the debate is presented as a very polarized debate and a very false debate. At times the image is given that in the East everybody's against migration and it's the old member states that are still pro-migration. Well, actually, if you look in the figures, 2017-2018, the country in the European Union granting the most residence permits for first-time third country nationals was actually Poland. Primarily for Ukrainians, but the point is we are facing a European Union in which the working age population is set to decline over the next 10-15 years by something like 20 million people. We're facing a reduction of our working age by some 19% over the foreseeable future. We do need to get better at attracting the brightest, the best, and attracting those skills which we are short of on the EU labour market. And one of the things we've been trying now in DG Home, and it's not easy when you've been trying these ideas in a kind of post-migration crisis context, is to make the case that there is value for the European Union to offer legal pathways for people with the skills that we need. So we've launched recently some pilot projects which are designed to show that when we work together, while the choice of who you admit on your territory will remain a national competence, there are benefits from working together. And we've just got the first projects in, so we've got some projects, I think, from Belgium, France, and Germany, primarily with the North African countries, so Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt. We've got an interesting little project from Lithuania with a sub-Saharan African country. And what we're trying to do is say, look, we can act, if you like, a tiny bit as a marriage broker. We'll support you in identifying the skills you need, the profiles you require, and we can then also help work with the partner countries so that we can find people with those skills, with those talents. And we can do this actually also in a broader migration relationship, providing comfort, if you like, and knowledge to our partners that there are legal pathways for their citizens to be able to come for a defined period of time and work regularly, legally in the EU. We've had good experience of this in the past with some of the pilot projects with Spain, particularly with Morocco, that in the late 90s, early 2000s was very much part of the Spanish approach to a broader migration management. And I think this will be something that will be very important as we move forward. I also think an important aspect of our work has been the engagement with what I would call the source countries, so the countries primarily from sub-Saharan Africa. One of the things we've been trying there is to change a bit the classical development model. So we've taken, in a first kind of attempt, we've taken around €1 billion of development aid. We've blended it with lending from the international financing institutions and then with private sector lending, and we've created a pool of around €44 billion of private sector funding in an external investment program, with the aim being to support the rise up the value chain of African industry, the African economy, and invest with partners to create more opportunities at home. And I think this is something where now with my team we're looking at how can we exploit some of these synergies, perhaps offering as well the possibility for people to come and acquire skills in a European Union company and then go home and be able to work in the foreign direct investment that's being made by the same company. So this should be quite exciting for the years ahead, and I think something that will be very much present in our attempts for the next, what we call financial perspectives, the next budget of the European Union, where this work with Africa and ability to try and accompany the rise up the value and the production chain of the African economy will be one of the top priorities. Now, I wanted just to end with a few words on integration, because I think if you look at the number of people who have arrived in the European Union in the years 2015, 2016, and if you look at average asylum recognition rates, we've a hell of a large number of people who are here to stay. And the one thing that is absolutely crystal clear is that the cost of investment in integration is much less than the cost of non-integration. Now, we've done a lot of work with people like the OECD, trying to get our head around what is your, if you like, your return on investment, to use a crude economic terminology. It's astoundingly high. In a best case scenario, the work we've done with the OECD shows you've got full cost recovery in 9 years. And go down to your local post office or savings bank today and tell them you'd like a full return on your capital in 9 years. There's nothing like that on the market. So this is good. It makes sense. We're also doing what we can to work in a broader societal context. So we've been working with a number of cities to advance best practice. We've created a little network led by the city of Amsterdam. And we've also been working with quite a few of the employers, big employers, people like IKEA and others, to demonstrate that actually many of the recent arrivals will be hugely productive for our own labour force, and they offer a wonderful opportunity also for our societies to benefit from the skills, commitment, passion, motivation and drive that many of them brought. I think one of the challenges as we move forward will be to ensure that we have adequate funding in place for this. What we're trying in very simple terms is to make sure that on the migration side, so the financial instruments that my own team are managing, that we're able to accompany the first stages in integration. So I would say, to be fairly crude about it, maybe the first 12 to 18 months, or where maybe people are within an asylum process for those who are coming for protection. I think the challenge is to make sure that in the longer term, people are also able to benefit from some of the measures under the social funds, the active employment measures, and this is what we've tried to do as well in the design of the new financial instruments for the next budgetary period. We've tried to make sure that one of the keys for distribution of funding is the number of third country nationals that have arrived in a country for the last few years. Now, there's much more I could say on many of these aspects, but I'll end now because I want to leave a bit of time for the question and answers afterwards. But I just want to end with one point, that I think our policy challenge as the European Union is not to stop migration. Anybody who says that is, I think, giving a false, misleading and illusionary objective. I think our policy challenge needs to be to replace the disorderly flows that we have witnessed over the last couple of years with orderly, well-managed migratory flows. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mordue, for a brilliant presentation. We'll have a common Q&A session after the next presentation, because I definitely have a few questions for you, and I'm sure the audience will have a few too. So our next speaker is Christian Dustmann, a professor at the University College London. He'll speak about evidence from a European context on the effects of immigration policies and integration programs. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. I prepared a presentation. Could we get that started, perhaps? Oh, there it is. Yes, so I would like to start with where Simon ended up with. I would like to talk about the integration of refugees into our labor markets and what we know about that and how we can actually address the challenges that there are. Before I do that, I would like to kind of go back some steps. And for those of you who are not very comfortable and very familiar with the topic, provide you with some numbers and some definitions. So the roadmap of my talk will be, well, first of all, of course, Europe has witnessed an unprecedented inflow of refugees over the past 5 years. That includes 2015. So as Simon pointed out, that has largely abated over the last 3 years. However, what we saw in 2015 and 2016 has had dramatic political implications. So we see polarization in many countries with regard to the political spectrum, and much of what we are seeing on the right is actually fueled by the topic of refugee migration or migration more generally, no matter whether actually the particular country is a country which has accepted large numbers of immigrants or not. So the topic is at the very forefront of that political debate. Germany, for instance, was in a very difficult position after the last elections, not least because the migration issue has cost Angela Merkel very dearly. And of course, that has repercussions for the European Union more generally, but also for world politics. And the deal which we struck with Turkey, for instance, which Simon pointed out, of course, on the other hand, also meant that the European Union, as a very crucial part of Turkish politics, had to be very careful in voicing any kind of views about what happened politically in Turkey. The key challenge, as Simon pointed out towards the end, now for European countries and very likely in the future, is actually to integrate those people who came to us. And why is that so important? Well, first of all, of course, we would like to achieve a status quo where those populations who come to us are self-sufficient in the sense that they basically pay their way not only in the economy but also in the welfare system and fiscally more generally. Why is that important for politics? Well, many of the issues which are related obviously or apparently to migration are actually issues which go back in terms of original migrations many decades. So in France, for instance, we didn't have much migration happening since the mid-80s. Nevertheless, migration is still fueling the right-wing populist movement in that country. And these are not migrants who came 2, 5 or 10 years ago. These are migrants who are now in the country in the second or third generation, but still create issues which can be used by particular populist movements, not least because potential failures in the way to integrate them many years ago. So let me first start with pointing out, and I will focus my talk here not so much on migration, but on refugee migration. So what is actually a refugee? Refugee is defined in the 1951 Geneva Convention as a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. So that is the definition of a refugee in the original 1951 Geneva Convention. As of April 2015, 145 states have signed that convention. All European countries are signatory of that convention. And the 1967 protocol, which has basically generalized the 1951 Geneva Convention for Refugees with an universal coverage. You will see immediately that one particular group, actually the group we are talking about today, is not covered by that convention. And that are individuals who are leaving their country because of conflict or war. Now, the Geneva Convention doesn't cover such individuals. It was not drawn up for such individuals. And as a result, countries in Europe and around the world have different forms of temporary or subsidiary humanitarian protections for those populations, which, however, again, are dealt with in very different ways across Europe or across the well-developed world more generally, creating its own problems. So how many refugees are there? To just give you some numbers, the UNHCR is referring to the population of concern as individuals who are either internally displaced or who move to neighboring countries or who are moving to a country which is a signatory of the Geneva Convention. So the number which refers to that population as of 2017 is 68.5 million. Of those 68.5 million individuals which are referred to by the UNHCR as refugees are individuals who are moving to a neighboring country, so individuals, for instance, who moved from Syria to Turkey or to any European country, or individuals who have been moved to a GCR country, and that is about 25.4 million. So let's just look at the global numbers and how those numbers have developed. Well, if we take kind of a long-term average from 2000 up to 2015, that number of the worldwide refugee stock, which excludes individuals who moved within a country, but includes all individuals who moved because of persecution or war to a neighboring country or to another third GCR country, was kind of around 10 million. That number has dramatically increased. By 2017, has actually doubled. So we saw over the past 5 years a dramatic increase worldwide in the number of refugees. Some of that has been absorbed, as I will show to you in a minute, from 2015 onwards by European countries, but much of it is actually happening in the third world more particularly. So just to give you an idea what was happening, these are the millions of people in terms of origin region. The two key developments here are individuals from Western and Southern Asia, so this includes the Middle East, and individuals from Africa. And we see after 2010 a sharp increase in those populations among the refugee population. So what are the key host regions? Again, within the region, most of that resettlement is actually happening. So the most important increases in terms of host regions are again individuals in, are again countries in Western and Southern Asia and countries in Africa. So much of the refugee population, which I have referred to 2 slides earlier, are actually displaced within the regions themselves. But an interesting development is actually the dramatic increase, not so much in numbers, but as percentage of the population of individuals who came to European countries from 2013, 14 onwards, which is given by this gray line here. Far less increases in terms of populations, refugee populations flowing into North America. And I'll come back to that towards the very end of my presentation. So what are the countries of origin? Well, countries of origin, as Simon already pointed at, mainly Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and to some extent Myanmar. These are kind of Asian migrations. We don't see many people arriving from those areas. The most important host countries, first of all Turkey, but then also Germany, Pakistan, Uganda, Lebanon, Iran, Bangladesh, etc. So what is the demographics? And that actually is very interesting. People are not aware of the demographic composition, in particular if it comes to age. Well, very much balanced among males and females, but the population of individuals among the refugee population, which is above, which is below 18 years, is actually 53%. So a very large part of individuals who are very young, who come as children or as teenagers to countries or move to countries that are different from where they are born. That, of course, at the same time is a big opportunity because individuals, the younger they are, the more they are able to integrate into our labor market, something I'm coming back to in a minute. So looking again at the origins, we see, and looking at the populations, looking again at the origins from this particular graph, it is pretty clear that Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq are main, sending countries. All three of them, of course, countries which in one way or the other have been very much affected by conflict, which not at least has to some extent started in relation to the Western world. If you look at Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, so these are countries that absorb by far the largest share of refugees from Syria, but also from Iraq. And what I have pointed out up there is actually the share of individuals who are resettled in those countries in terms of their own population. So 16.7% of Lebanon's population is now of refugee origin. That compares to fairly small numbers. So the largest country in Europe is Sweden with about 3%, or Germany with 1.7%. Okay, so let me talk about integration. And I think before I want to do that, I first would like to point out the difference we have between a refugee migrant and an economic migrant. So economic migrants are something we are all familiar with, and until about 10 years ago, it was economic migration which concerned most European countries and which we tried to regulate by implementing regulation and immigration rules. So what is the difference between a refugee and an economic migrant? Well, first of all, a refugee usually does not choose to migrate. So many of those who are now living in Turkey, who are coming from Syria, could not have imagined 5 or 6 or 10 years ago that they would ever move to another country. So refugees do not choose their migration, and therefore they are typically not prepared for the migration. That's very different for economic migrants. Economic migrants are choosing to migrate. They migrate on the basis of economic calculations. So their human capital, their skills, have a higher value in the country to which they are moving, which usually is the reason for their migration. They prepare for that migration. So the classical example are nurses from Nigeria who undergo nursing training because they intend to migrate to the UK and to work in the NHS. But there are many other examples where we have thorough preparation of migrants who come for economic reasons that are related to their migration. So very big difference in the type of preparedness to move to another country. Second big difference is there is limited or no selection according to economic, cultural, and social circumstances of those migrants who come to us as refugees. That's very different for economic migrants. As I said earlier, they are very prepared for the migration, but they're also very often very selected. So it is important for a migrant not just to go to another country because the wages are high, but what is also important is that, well, there is an environment for their families they find convenient, that there is a culture they find important, that there are circumstances which are relating to their preferences for how they would like to live their life that are in one way or another convenient for them. So the selection of groups of refugees which we receive is very much different from that of economic migrants. So limited adaptability is, of course, a consequence and something which is challenging for us when we want to integrate those populations. And thirdly, well, there is limited preparation for refugee migrants. There is limited economic need very often for refugee migrants. On the other hand, what we are seeing in terms of economic migrants is very often a response of those migrant populations to particular economic demands. So, for instance, in 2004, Tony Blair opened up to the A8 countries in terms of free movement. That clearly was something was very strongly mandated by a huge skill gap in the British labour market if it comes to the trades, but also many other skilled or semi-skilled or also unskilled occupations. So economically driven demand is often the reason for economic immigration, while host countries are often caught unprepared for conflicts which then generate large refugee migrations. And all these things have to be kept in mind when we compare the assimilation and the integration of these two groups. And also when we think about politics, as Simon pointed out, which help refugees to actually integrate more successfully into our labor market. So let me give you some numbers here. Of course, there are two other things which are important, and I should mention. Refugees are often traumatized by their recent experience. There is an increasing body of work now which shows that there are serious mental health issues for migrant populations, basically driven by the particular experiences they had in the countries where they were coming from. That is particularly so for very young individuals or children, and I have shown you before that children make a large part of refugee migrations. Then, of course, there is uncertainty about future outcomes. Economic migrants are either getting permits which are restricted to a very particular period, or they know exactly the conditions under which those permits can become permanent. That's not the case for refugee migrants. So refugee migrants are very often receiving, at least initially, temporary permits which allow them to stay or to be protected for a particular period, which are then up to renewal, but whether such renewal is granted, at least in the early phase of their migrations, is very uncertain. So that is, of course, exactly the period when investments into skills which are important for the host country's labor market are undertaken. The skills I have mainly in mind here are language capital, but also other skills which are important, for instance, for the Danish economy. Now, I had breakfast with Simon this morning and we discussed exactly that particular issue. Countries which have a very institutionalized labor market find this particular aspect very challenging. So, for instance, if you take a baker in Germany, in order to work as a baker, to run a little baking company, to run your own bakery, you need to have gone through apprenticeship training. Germany has a very institutionalized labor market with 65% of the working population having gone through that type of training. Apprenticeship training takes 3 years. It pays you a wage which is far lower than the wage you can get in the labor market as an unskilled worker. So suppose you have a Syrian migrant who would like to work as a baker. Now, to explain to that migrant, that the only way to success in Germany is to go through apprenticeship training. But at the same time, I cannot give you a permit to actually stay permanently in the country, is kind of a non-starter. because that particular training is very costly for the individual, but will have no value when that individual will have to go back or may have to go back to Damascus or any other city. Because there it really doesn't matter whether you are a learned baker or not. It will not affect the way you can sell your bread. And you can think about similar examples in many other European countries. So the certainty we give to these individuals about the validity of their investments into the kind of skills we need in our country is very, very important and needs to be considered when we think about permits of duration. So let me give you some figures. The big challenge if we talk about refugee migration is that data is very hard to come by. And that has many reasons. First of all, as I showed you earlier, the refugee population in most countries is very small. Now, that means that survey data, which covers populations but draws random samples from populations, usually suffers from very small numbers of observations, which refers to refugees. Second challenge is, even if such data is available, very often refugees are not singled out. So we know whether an individual is foreign born, but very often we don't know whether that individual has arrived as a refugee or as a labor migrant or as a family reunified migrant. And so I guess these are the two main reasons. So what we have done in this particular study is we have to try to gain a picture nevertheless. First of all, by writing to many authors who have actually worked with administrative data from Scandinavian countries, also from the US, and also from Canada, and asked them to provide us with particular statistics on refugee populations. So Marie-Louise was one of those who we are very grateful for that she provided us with some of that data. And then we have put that all together to get some picture, a comparative picture about how refugee populations compared to immigrant populations are doing in different countries. The second source were specialized surveys that only cover refugees. And the third source are surveys which cover refugees as well as other immigrants. And we provided we analyzed that data ourselves. And then finally, there is the European Labour Force Survey 2008 and 2014, which provides us with information about refugee status. But again, because that is a normal survey, it suffers from fairly low numbers of observations. Nevertheless, let me try to give you a picture. So an important economic integration measure, of course, is employment. And what I have on this graph here is, well, drawing on all these different sources, the development of employment rates on the left side for refugees and for other immigrant groups, which include labor migrants and family reunified migrants on the right side. And what you see immediately is actually that, well, there is a big difference. And the big difference is, well, first of all, there is a lot of variation across countries. But then in the early years, employment rates of refugee migrants are actually dramatically low, particularly if we compare them to other immigrant groups. What we also see that is in those early years, the increase in employment rates is most dramatic, and then it kind of leveled out. Nevertheless, over the period of 10 years, there is no catch-up. So other immigrant groups throughout the countries we have been covering here, which include Denmark, Norway, Australia, Germany, United Kingdom, USA, Jordan, and Sweden, are always more likely to be employed than refugees. So this is something which we also find throughout the literature reflected in most papers which focus on particular countries. So refugee migrations are more problematic in terms of participation rates in the labor market than other immigrant groups. To give you that a little bit more detailed. So, for instance, the gap to other immigrant employment rates or the gap to the native employment rate for Canada, Finland, Norway and Sweden is 19 percentage points, 40 percentage points, 69 percentage points, 20 percentage points. That reduces to 7, 34, 26 and 7 percentage points. So we see a reduction in that gap, similarly to native workers, but over the period of 10 years, it is clearly not closing. And there is large heterogeneity in the initial gap and in the gap after 10 years across countries, which has many reasons. To some of them, I would like to come back towards the end. Now, another particular feature of refugee migrations is the large differential in employment rates between males and females, and the increase, which is much more marked for the male population than the female population. So the low employment rates I have shown you before are mainly driven by females having very low employment rates in refugee populations. So another issue which we really need to deal with in Europe and beyond if we want to be successful to integrate those populations into our labor markets. Now, wages are even harder to get by for refugees than employment rates. This again is based on the same data from many authors kindly made available to us, among them of course, actually we don't have the Danish data in here because we don't have wages for Denmark, but for some other countries. So again, you see that the refugee native wage ratio, which we have in those figures, is actually much larger for refugees than it is for other immigrant groups. So not only that a far smaller share of refugees is working, but their relative wages for those who are working are actually more disadvantaged relative to natives than those of other immigrant groups. Now, this is an interesting graph, and it's based on the European Labour Force Survey, which is pooling here the years 2008 and 2014. And what we have done here in this graph, we have plotted the employment rates of refugees towards the employment rates of other immigrants. And we look at three different groups: individuals who are in the country for less than 10 years, individuals who are in the country for between 11 and 19 years, and individuals who are in the country for more than 20 years. So this is different data and partly different countries as well. Again, what you are seeing is, so whenever a dot is below the 45-degree line, the employment rates of refugees are lower than those of other immigrants, and if the dot is above the 45-degree line, the opposite is the case. So a clear disadvantage in the first 10 years after settlement. However, this largely disappears with a lot of variation across countries after 10 years and between 10 and 30 years. We have to be careful to interpret such numbers because they are based on what we call single cross-sections. So that means if we observe somebody who has been in the country 30 years, for 30 years, that is not somebody who is coming from the same cohort which we observe for, say, only 1 year. Because in 2014, somebody in the country for 1 year must have arrived in 2013. Somebody in the country for 10 years must have arrived in 2004. So the composition is, of course, changing. But it gives you some picture which is very much in line with the very different data I have shown you in the previous slides. Now, a very important aspect of integration is language. Language is not only important in its own right, it's not only important because it is itself productive. It's not only important because it allows social assimilation, but it is a very important multiplier of other skills. So if you have a surgeon who comes from Poland and wants to work in the British Health Service, doesn't speak the language, that individual is not very productive. You can't have a surgeon who can't communicate with other health staff in the common language. However, if that surgeon would learn the English language, the productivity of that individual would increase dramatically. So language has always been a very important aspect of refugee or immigrant productivity. And what you see here is actually very similar diagram than before. So two things to take away from this diagram. First of all, for refugees and other immigrants, and the farther I go, well, to the outer parts of this line, the better the language capacity of the respective population or respective populations. So language capacity increases basically for all immigrant groups over time. So we move from here to the outer part of this diagram. The other thing you see immediately is that, well, refugees at any point in their migration history have language skills, language proficiencies, which are below those of other immigrant groups. And again, very important kind of lesson to draw from that and other work which finds very similar developments. Language and language education at very early stages is very important. So, how much time do I have? So, okay, so I'll be I think I just want you to take away one thing from this particular graph here. This is again based on the European Labour Force Survey, and it is looking at the employment gap relative to natives, conditional on particular, individual characteristics. Now, the overall employment gap for all non-refugee immigrants relative to natives is around 5 percentage points. So 5 percentage points lower employment on average of immigrants relative to natives across European countries. For refugees, it is 25 percentage points. So large difference in terms of employment gaps. Now, if we condition on the host country, so that means we are looking at refugees and natives within a particular country, that gap is actually increasing for refugees. Now, that indicates that refugees are going to countries predominantly where employment rates are high. So it's not just that they are randomly allocated, but we find them mainly in countries where actually economic conditions are favorable. If we condition on age, the gap again is increasing. That is because refugees are mainly young. Nevertheless, if we compare them to other young people, the differential is even increasing. If we condition on gender, not much is happening. If we condition on education, gap is about the same. And if we condition on everything, the gap is actually increasing from 25 percentage points to 34. So basically, if we make refugees equal to natives in those observable characteristics, we actually increase the gap even more than what the raw data is showing us. So these, of course, we should be all very careful in looking at these numbers, because they are averages, they are meant to give a general picture, but there is huge heterogeneity across different countries if it comes to the origins of the refugee populations with respect to the success with which different countries have managed to actually integrate them into the labor market and with respect to, the cultural, religious, and educational affiliation of those populations. So large heterogeneity, large differences across countries. Nevertheless, I think what I wanted to get out of this, or what I wanted to more or less say with this here is, well, first of all, refugees are not immigrants. So we have, as signatories, as the Geneva Convention, have a humanitarian duty to give protection to individuals who are persecuted in various forms. So that, of course, creates a situation where we take in populations which require more intensive investments in order to adopt them to our labor markets. And that is clearly one of the biggest challenges many European countries face for the future. One of the biggest challenges, I think, for Europe as a whole, and I would hope that is taken more serious than it has been taken if we go back into the 80s and to the 90s, not least in this country. Now, let me just summarize. Overall, refugees lag behind other immigrants in the labor market assimilation, which is, the case for wages as well as employment, particularly so in the first few years, but there is clearly some catch-up. There are large differences between males and females, very much related, of course, to the origins of many of these populations and their cultural habits. Refugees have lower language proficiency, and within Europe, refugees are found mainly in economically more prosperous countries. So let me spend 5 minutes on the future. Simon pointed out that at the moment there is actually a dramatic decrease in numbers. So the number of refugees coming to us at the moment is actually very manageable. However, if we kind of look at the challenges for the future, then 60% of the population in Africa, which is the neighboring continent just on the other side of the Mediterranean, is at the moment below 25 compared to 27% in Europe. So the age structure in Africa is one which is dramatically different from that in Europe. The economic opportunities for those 60% are actually in many countries very dark. So that creates a huge potential of individuals who are looking for new opportunities. And many of these opportunities, traditionally, humans have always sought by actually walking away from where they are to somewhere where the future looks brighter. And clearly Europe is for many that continent. The population of Africa, moreover, will increase from currently 1.3 billion to 2.5 billion in 2050. So Africa is the fastest growing continent. At the moment, Africa will account for more than half of the global population growth between 2017 and 2050. And until 2050, 26 countries in Africa are projected to double their current size, according to the UN. So what we are facing as Europe, and the Middle East is not very different. So very high population growth in the Middle East as well. What we are facing in Europe is basically a continent which will be characterized by very fast and very dramatic population growth. At the same time, among the 20 countries that are ranked highest according to the 2019 Fragile State Index, 15 are located in Africa and 3 in the Middle East. So the political structures we see in these countries are very fragile. Political stability is very fragile as well. So that combination, of course, is very often a very strong source for individuals to live, to seek other places to migrate to. So the challenges for Europe are clearly there. So what we have done in this graph here is we have just taken the population projections, the 2017 population growth, and we have plotted it against the Fragile State Index. And what you see here is a very strong correlation between countries which have a high population growth and at the same time have a very high index in terms of fragility. The red countries are African countries, the orange countries are South American countries. So I would like to end with a brief comparison between Europe and the challenges we face for the future and the United States. If you, take those countries which at the moment have the highest refugee share, you will see that those countries are all located at the very end of this particular graph. So they are characterized by high fragility, at the same time by very high population growth. Now, all these countries are actually in the Middle East or in Africa. All these countries are in Africa, and if we compare that to countries in Latin America, they are more stable and at the same time have lower population growth. So if you look at the challenges for the future, it is clearly Europe who has to deal with far larger challenges than the United States, although the rhetoric we are seeing at the moment seem to suggest otherwise. Now that means that in Europe, in my view, we need to take this far more serious, and I think the way forward here is to make sure that Africa develops in a way which makes it worthwhile for Africans actually to live in their own continent. So that means we need to take economic development and action to create economic security, but particularly also political stability and political security much more serious. We have to spend much more resources towards that particular goal, because if we don't do it, the consequences, for Africa, but also for Europe, will be very severe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Christian and Simon, will you come and join me here for a few follow-up questions from the floor? Because I think it's been very interesting presentations, and there might be a few questions for you. At least I have one for you, Christian. Can you tell me why such a large percentage of the refugees are youngsters?
Young.
Young, yeah. I mean, as you said, children or teenagers.
Yes. I don't know. Well, for once, parents care about their children, so it may be young parents who have children who, seek another future for themselves and their children. Migration becomes far more costly when you are older, because it is physically very demanding, in particular when we talk about refugee migration. It also provides far less opportunities in the countries to where we go. It's already very hard for somebody above 50 to find a job in Denmark if you're born in Denmark and qualified. So for a refugee, it is nearly impossible. So the economic opportunities are far diminished. And of course, the link to your own country and to your own neighborhood, despite all types of adverse conditions, are much stronger if you age. So we usually see populations being very young. In this particular population, the refugee population, we see, overwhelmingly many children, but that partly is related to the age structure we have in those countries where individuals are actually coming from. I have shown you as well that the African population is very young. And so is the population in many Middle East countries.
Okay, Simon, you spoke about the situation in Turkey. What do you think? What is it like in Turkey at the moment now when it comes to Syrian refugees? Is it stable? Is it strained? What do you hear from your Turkish counterparts?
I mean, we also have. Is that working?
No, it is.
Yes, okay. We've also got, obviously, our team in the delegation in Turkey who regularly visit also the refugee camps and observe the situation. I would say I think the Turkish population, the Turkish administration is still doing a remarkably good job. The conditions generally are very good. Syrians still get quasi-automatically guest status, or an equivalent status to refugees. The labour market has been opened. There are Syrians working regularly. There are large numbers of Syrians also working on the black market irregularly. but I think that overall the situation allows us on the side of the EU to consider that for Syrians, Turkey largely continues to be a safe third country.
Okay, and so a question related to that, because you said it's very difficult for the Greeks to return immigrants to Turkey. Why is that, and what can we do to help the Greeks?
I think we have had some successful experiences. Last year we ran a small pilot project on the island of Kos, where we had a large number of citizens from Pakistan arrive within a concentrated time frame. And we said to the government, look, let's just demonstrate that when all of the different actors work together, so that means the health, because you need medical checks for vulnerability, it means the Greek asylum service, it means the police, it means the appeals authorities, you can actually process returns in a fairly determined manner. So we ran a pilot project with, I think it was 72 Pakistani citizens, and within 6 to 8 weeks they had managed to return over 50. I think one of the challenges that Greece often faces is coordinating across different departments and administration and ensuring that everybody is following the same order of priority.
But has that something to do with the historic differences between the Turks and the Greeks? They're maybe not very good at cooperating, or is it other factors?
I don't think that's really a main issue. I would actually say that in some of the recent contacts, the messages we've been having from the Turks is please actually send us more returns. We desperately need them, also as a way for us being better able to tackle some of the propaganda of the smugglers who are still saying you effectively buy a passage to Greece and your chance of returning is close to zero.
Okay. Well, Christian, just a question for you before we see if there are any from the floor. We've had a shift in paradigm in Denmark towards a job-first focus, and we're going to hear about this in a short while. And that means that maybe people will be able to deal with their traumas, maybe PTSD, even within a job. And so do you have other European countries working within this field, and are they successful?
Well, a lot of, well, first let me say the best integrator is the labor market, no matter what. However, individuals have to be able to work in a way that their productivity is above the current minimum wage. And that, of course, is a huge challenge. If you don't speak the language and you don't have skills which are immediately transferable, in countries like Denmark, you may actually be not productive enough for firms to employ you. So in order to get people into work, we have to bring them to a level where their productivity is at least as high as the minimum wage. And while they struggle to acquire that education, we need to appropriately support them to make sure they don't become move in a direction which is not very good for them and which is not very good for us. Now, having said that, and of course, going back to that point, the absorption capacity of different countries, if it comes to refugees, is of course very different. So Simon pointed out Turkey. So Erdogan, as far as I understand, is actually very keen to get Syrians into particular areas of Turkey. That may have political reasons, but it also suggests that he, at least, and some of his officials see some advantages of that population in Turkey, to settle them, to make them active members of their labor markets. The same populations may be harder to adopt in more Nordic countries, for instance, because the differences are larger, the skill requirements are very different, the cultural differences are also larger. So, there is different ability of different countries to absorb refugee or immigrant populations. Another example is the difference between the very institutionalized German labor market, where investments are often lengthy, at the same time where there are disincentives to undertake such investments unless there is a permanent or at least long-term perspective over which that particular investment is actually paying off to the individual. And on the other hand, a country like Italy with a large shadow economy, where it is much easier to absorb populations with very low skill levels. Now, coming very briefly back to your first question, I think one very positive aspect of what we have seen in Germany is a lot of experimentation with all types of ways to integrate refugee populations. While it's not just state-driven or government-driven initiatives, but there are many employer associations. For instance, the example about the baker I gave you, I have from a baker congress to which I went and talked about immigration, and where different baker companies were very seriously interested in trying to get these people into work, get them into their factories, get them into their workshops to actually become productive. And they faced all types of problems, cultural problems, problems which are related to investment, etc. But I think by learning about that and by trying hard to actually make it better for those populations, we will create structures which in future makes it slightly easier for us to absorb individuals who are culturally and also, if it comes to their skill level, very different from us.
Thank you. Well, any questions or comments from the floor? Yeah.
My name is Nick Tan. I've got two questions for Simon. The first relates to cessation and revocation. You've spoken a lot about returns, which makes very good sense, and integration. But in my view, the sort of policy shifts in Denmark today is actually around the end of protection. Questions around when is it safe to return a person either with convention status or even subsidiary status. So is Denmark a front runner in this area or an exception? And the second question relates to resettlement and complementary pathways. So of the 1.4 million refugees requiring resettlement last year, 55,600 were in fact resettled. So I wonder if you could speak to the potential for complementary pathways in providing third country solutions. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think on the question of cessation, revocation, one of the challenges you face is the dilemma between wanting people to properly integrate and wanting to, perhaps for your own domestic consumption, give the impression that people are not here to stay. They are perhaps two mutually, not always, supporting objectives. Integration is difficult. Integration takes a long time. Integration requires investment both from the state where somebody is living, but also from the individual. The example Christian just gave about some of the kind of formal qualifications needed on the German labour market is one example of that. I think if you want people to really integrate, you're probably going to need to give them a semi-permanent perspective. How you reconcile that with developments on their own territory, which may mean that their country is safe to return to, is a challenging one. I think in terms of the legislation, we do have legislation in the EU related to the long-term residence status, which effectively provides that after somebody has been established legally somewhere for 5 years, they would have a right to remain. So I think this is something which is a challenge and is not going to be an easy one to deal with. We do have experience after the Balkans, where large numbers of people that had been settled from first Bosnia, to a lesser extent than Kosovo, chose voluntarily to return. But I think it's a very, very difficult situation. Personally, I don't feel very happy or comfortable at the moment. This is just a personal reflection with a debate on returning people to Syria when you're still reading on attacks which are endangering people's lives and which would certainly lead me to question whether Syria effectively can be considered somewhere safe today. On the question of complementary pathways, I think here we still have, as the European Union, much that we can learn from some of the experience, I would say, perhaps more positively from Canada. One area we're looking at the moment, and we're trying to run some pilot projects, is on this notion of private sponsorship, where yes, you need a state to feel comfortable with people moving, but you would be giving some space for companies, for groups of individuals to take the lead in welcoming and supporting a refugee and his or her family. And this is something which I think I would like to see us getting more active on. For the future, I would like, ideally, and if we were repeating this event in 5 years' time, to see the proportion of people that have arrived in Europe and benefited from protection coming by resettlement to be much, much higher. I'm not saying by that I think we should adopt a policy that anybody who arrives irregularly can't claim protection. I don't think that is on the agenda, and I don't personally think that is either feasible from the geography of Europe nor desirable from the moral point of view. But I do think our aim should be to basically not have people feel that they need to pay a smuggler to be able to benefit from protection and to risk their lives. I also think that has one other huge advantage for us, because if you look at the profile of people that would come by resettlement as opposed to via the smuggler's route, I think when it's done by resettlement, you're much better able to reach the more vulnerable and family groups. With smugglers, it tends often to be young males, and what we're also often witnessing is, particularly due to the legislation that exists in some member states, a number of families from countries which would not necessarily lead rise to protection for their citizens choose deliberately to send their unaccompanied children to Europe as a way for them to be able to stay. So I'm a huge fan of resettlement, but I think within this we have a lot of work still to do to develop complementary pathways, also like private sponsorship.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? No? Oh, well, yes, there is one.
Yeah, so my name is Jeppe. I was wondering what consequences did the refugees have on the Turkish economy, like in terms of GDP and such?
I think that's a difficult one to quantify at the moment, because the Turkish economy, perhaps for reasons not directly linked to the presence of the refugees, is going through a difficult time.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I can extend on that a little bit. So there is a lot of research now. The data in Turkey is quite good, so we know where Syrians are settling. And there are a number of papers that try to understand what impact that has on local labor markets. So at the moment, things are still very much in flux, and any such analysis has to be looked at with some caution. So my reading at the moment is that we find some studies who seem to find positive impacts on local labor markets, but other studies which also suggest some displacement of Turkish workers in particular skill groups. So not anything which suggests this is catastrophic, but also not anything which suggests this is highly beneficial. And I think it needs to, we need to give that a little bit more time until the data is better and the processes have sunk in to give a definite answer to that particular question.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, it's been a great pleasure having you here in Copenhagen this morning. Thank you very much for joining us.